A single cargo container holds approximately 26 tons of pomegranates. In October of 2021, Saudi customs officers at Jeddah Islamic Port opened one such container arriving from Lebanon and extracted over 5 million small, off-white pills stamped with a characteristic double crescent logo. The weight of the active chemical substance inside those pills was less than 800 kilograms. Yet the street value of the shipment exceeded $24 million. This discrepancy, where a chemical paste hidden inside agricultural refuse is worth 300 times the value of the harvest that conceals it, is the foundation of an economic machine that rewired the geography of the Middle East over a decade. The machine had a specific name, Captagon, and a specific sovereign architect. To understand how a region became dependent on a single molecule, one must look at a balance sheet from Damascus in 2015. Under the pressure of international sanctions, Syria's formal GDP had collapsed by more than 60% in 4 years. The state lacked foreign currency to import fuel, pay military salaries, or maintain the loyalty of auxiliary militias. Industrial manufacturing requires stable infrastructure, raw inputs, and access to legal banking channels, all of which had vanished. But the production of phenethylene hydrochloride requires only basic precursors like phenylacetic acid, a standard pill press, and a secure perimeter. The 4th Armored Division of the Syrian Army, commanded by Maher al-Assad, provided that perimeter across industrial sites in Latakia and Homs. By 2019, the production lines had reached military precision. What began as a decentralized network of wartime laboratories transformed into a centralized state enterprise. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime later verified that, between January of 2019 and late 2024, 80% of all Captagon seizures across Southwest Asia originated from these specific state-managed hubs. This was not a shadow cartel operating in defiance of a government. It was the government itself operating as a cartel. Estimates by independent financial analysts place the annual revenue of this trade between $5.7 billion and $30 billion. For comparison, the entire legal budget of the Syrian state during this period hovered below $3 billion. The pill was no longer an auxiliary source of income. It was the primary financial engine, keeping the regime alive. This engine worked because it exploited a fundamental asymmetric vulnerability in the neighboring Gulf states. In countries like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, rapid urbanization and a young, affluent demographic created an insatiable demand for stimulants. Captagon was marketed not as a destructive narcotic, but as a functional aid. A pill to help students study through the night, to allow long-haul truck drivers to complete their shifts, or to sustain construction workers under 50-degree heat. The scale of consumption grew to the point where the Saudi government was forced to construct an entire regional security architecture around a single objective, stopping the flow of Syrian amphetamines, for 5 years. That architecture dictated the foreign policy of the region. Jordan deployed mechanized infantry to fight running battles against heavily armed smuggling convoys along its northern desert border. Radar systems designed to detect military aircraft were recalibrated to track low-flying drones carrying packages across the frontier. Gulf intelligence agencies used diplomatic normalizations and billions of dollars in potential reconstruction aid as leverage, explicitly offering Bashar al-Assad financial incentives if his military units would simply turn off the pill presses. The entire regional status quo rested on the assumption that the problem had an address, a single point of origin that could be blockaded, bought out, or policed. Then came the morning of December 8, 2024. A lightning military offensive led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham bypassed the defensive lines of the 4th Armored Division in less than a week. By noon, Bashar al-Assad was on a plane to Moscow, ending 53 years of family rule. The world's attention focused on the geopolitical vacuum, the diplomatic realignments, and the crowds tearing down statues in Damascus. But the collapse of a state structure does not erase its material components. The 15 industrial laboratories, the 13 major chemical storage facilities, the automated pill presses, and the thousands of tons of precursor chemicals did not vanish when the ministers fled. Instead, the infrastructure shattered into pieces. Militia commanders, who had spent a decade managing specific segments of the logistics chain, suddenly found themselves without a central commander or a state payroll. Technicians and chemists with deep pharmaceutical expertise were left unemployed in a wrecked economy. The secure routes previously guarded by military intelligence fragmented into hundreds of localized fiefdoms controlled by tribal leaders and local warlords. The new transitional authorities under Ahmed al-Shara attempted to secure the known facilities, dismantling dozens of large-scale operations within their first year. But they were chasing a shadow that had already begun to mutate. The traffickers did not retire. They looked at the market, evaluated the logistical constraints of a post-Assad landscape, and realized that the old model was obsolete. The system was about to birth something far more efficient, far more potent, and completely invisible to the defenses built to stop it. The primary technical vulnerability of an industrial drug state is its dependence on a visible chemical supply chain. To manufacture billions of Captagon pills, the Syrian network required thousands of metric tons of pseudoephedrine and formamide, compounds that arrive not in suitcases but in industrial maritime containers through ports like Latakia. When the central authority in Damascus dissolved on December 8, 2024, the administrative cover that allowed these chemicals to enter under the guise of legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing vanished instantly. The international banking channels used by front companies froze, and the customs manifests that previously cleared bulk precursors were replaced by local oversight. Within 90 days, the wholesale price of raw chemical precursors inside Syria surged by 400%. This raw material scarcity triggered an immediate economic feedback loop that altered the physical composition of the drug itself. Denied access to bulk legal imports, remaining production cells began using crude domestic substitutes, extracting ephedrine from over-the-counter cold medicines, or turning to highly toxic industrial solvents. The resulting pills became chemically volatile, causing high rates of acute poisoning among users in neighboring markets. As the quality plummeted, the wholesale value of a standard Captagon shipment inside the Gulf market dropped from $20 per pill to less than $3 by mid-2025. The high-volume, low-margin model was no longer financially viable for decentralized networks operating without state subsidies. To survive, the fragmented trafficking networks enacted a structural pivot toward a far more concentrated commodity: crystal methamphetamine, locally known as shabu. In pure economic terms, the efficiency of methamphetamine renders Captagon obsolete. A single kilogram of high-purity crystal meth possesses the market value of approximately 50,000 Captagon pills, while occupying less than 1/20th of the physical volume. It requires no heavy industrial machinery, no centralized factory floor, and no multi-stage synthetic process that leaves a thermal or chemical footprint detectable by satellite surveillance. The production cycle was stripped down from a state-run military enterprise to a domestic cottage industry. By June of 2025, the geography of production had completely decentralized into what intelligence analysts call the ghost economy. Instead of fortified military compounds in the Syrian desert, the manufacturing shifted to ordinary kitchen laboratories, residential apartments in Amman, rented farmhouses in Iraq's Al-Anbar province, and light industrial garages on the outskirts of Kuwait City. The entire production apparatus for a batch of shabu can fit inside the trunk of a standard sedan. If regional security forces raid a location, the economic loss to the cartel is negligible. The cooks simply procure a new set of glassware and resume operations 3 blocks away within 48 hours. Interdiction strategies built around border checkpoints and naval blockades were fundamentally unequipped to counter a threat that was now generating inside the target metropolitan areas themselves. This decentralization produced a catastrophic social chain reaction across the Gulf states. Driven by the unique neurotoxicity of the new molecule, Captagon, an amphetamine derivative, functions primarily as a functional stimulant. It accelerates heart rate and delays exhaustion. Methamphetamine, conversely, acts as a direct neurotoxic sledgehammer. A single dose induces a dopamine flood measured at 1250% above baseline, permanently damaging the brain's vesicular monoamine transporters. Within weeks of regular use, the neurological architecture responsible for processing natural rewards, food, social attachment, familial duty, is physically incinerated by late 2025, public health infrastructure across the region began to buckle under a sudden influx of acute psychiatric emergencies. Unlike the predictable dependency patterns of the previous decade, Shabu users presented with severe, treatment-resistant psychosis, profound paranoia, and unpredictable bursts of extreme physical violence. A retrospective analysis conducted at major trauma units in Riyadh and Jeddah revealed that methamphetamine-related admissions increased by 312% between January and November of 2025. Crucially, 42% of these cases involved violent altercations within the patient's own household, exposing a crisis that could no longer be contained within the margins of society. The ultimate failure mechanism, however, was not medical, but cultural. In the collectivist societies of the Middle East, family survival depends on the preservation of sharaf, communal honor, and reputation. When a family member exhibits symptoms of severe meth-induced psychosis, the immediate structural reaction is not medical intervention, but absolute concealment. Admitting that a son or daughter is a Shabu addict inflicts a permanent social stigma that effectively destroys the marriage prospects, economic credit, and social standing of the entire extended household. Consequently, families systematically isolated afflicted individuals, locking them in back rooms, turning to traditional religious healers, or disowning them entirely to preserve the domestic collective. This defensive silence acted as a massive accelerant for the epidemic. By hiding the users, communities inadvertently allowed the infection vector to operate without friction. When public health authorities in Jordan conducted an anonymous survey in late 2025, they discovered that 84% of active methamphetamine users had never interacted with a formal rehabilitation program, specifically citing the destruction of family reputation as the primary barrier to seeking help. Every attempt by regional governments to suppress the crisis through traditional means only accelerated its momentum. In October of 2025, a massive naval task force intercepted $96 million worth of crystal meth aboard twin dhows in the Arabian Sea. While heralded as a triumph by state media, the seizure merely demonstrated the immense overproduction occurring at the source. In an economic system where the profit margins exceed 3,000%, a 90% interception rate still leaves the trafficking networks highly profitable. The massive losses thinned out smaller, independent actors, consolidating the trade into the hands of highly organized, hyper-violent transnational syndicates that operated across Pakistan, Iran, and the Levant. By the final weeks of 2025, the regional drug market had crossed a definitive structural threshold. The old paradigm, where a single rogue state produced a predictable pill that could be stopped at a hard border, was entirely dead. In its place stood a borderless, self-replicating chemical wildfire, fueled by cheap domestic synthesis, shielded by absolute social silence, and targeting a population with no historical immunity to its psychological devastation. The machinery of state control was still functioning, firing missiles at border convoys and issuing severe legal decrees. But the enemy was no longer at the gates. It was already inside the living rooms, silently rewiring the collective brain of the region, completely unchecked by the institutions built for a world that had ceased to exist. By June of 2026, the geographic focus of the regional drug trade has completed its mutation, shifting away from state-backed factories entirely and embedding itself into the lawless borderlands of Southwest Asia. The primary source of the raw materials feeding the Gulf's methamphetamine epidemic is no longer an industrial chemical plant, but a wild shrub called ephedra, known locally as Oman, which grows abundantly in the mountainous terrain of central Afghanistan at altitudes exceeding 2,500 meters. When the Taliban authorities initiated a harsh crackdown on domestic processing labs in late 2024 and 2025, publicly claiming the destruction of dozens of production sites, they did not eliminate the trade. They merely forced the supply chain to adapt. The processing networks simply migrated across the frontier into Pakistan's Balochistan province and the porous tri-border zone where Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan converge. In these vast ungoverned spaces, local tribal cartels buy dried ephedra by the truckload from impoverished mountain harvesters who earn $30 a day, a fortune in a collapsed rural economy. The raw plant material is boiled down in primitive mobile vats to extract pure ephedrine, which is then converted into high-purity crystal meth using basic, non-regulated chemicals. Because the primary precursor grows wild in the ground, it is entirely immune to international trade sanctions, chemical export bans, or maritime blockades. This hyper-cheap supply flows westward along ancient smuggling corridors, entering the affluent markets of the Gulf through a complex web of land, sea, and air routes that traditional border security models are structurally incapable of monitoring. Traffickers have abandoned large, conspicuous overland convoys in favor of decentralized, high-tech delivery methods. Throughout early 2026, customs registries in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates recorded a sharp increase in the interception of commercial cargo drones and low-altitude GPS-guided balloons carrying compact, high-value payloads of shabu across the desert frontiers. The marginal cost of losing a single drone is negligible to networks operating with profit margins that regularly exceed 3,000%. The economic and social toll within the consumer states is now compounding exponentially, creating a permanent structural drag on regional development. The primary victims of this chemical invasion are no longer marginal demographic groups, but the core economic engine of the region, young adults between the ages of 18 and 30. A comprehensive public health study, scheduled for release in late June 2026, indicates that the rapid spread of methamphetamine has created a severe dual stigma crisis that falls with particular devastation on young women. According to preliminary data from specialized psychiatric centers, female shabu users exhibit significantly higher rates of severe comorbidities like treatment-resistant depression and post-traumatic stress disorder compared to male users because of the rigid social codes governing family honor. These women are systematically hidden from view by their households, delaying medical treatment until their neurological damage has progressed to permanent cognitive impairment or irreversible psychosis. When an individual does manage to complete a formal detoxification program, the structure of the society prevents long-term recovery. Data from rehabilitation centers in Riyadh indicates that while initial medical detox has a reasonable success rate, the 6-month relapse rate for patients returning to their communities exceeds 70%. Employers routinely terminate workers with a history of substance abuse, and families frequently ostracize recovered individuals, systematically stripping away the social fabric required to prevent a return to the drug network. The response from regional governments has been characterized by massive financial expenditure directed at lagging indicators rather than root causes. While interior ministries continue to celebrate multi-million-dollar seizures at maritime ports and publicize severe judicial decrees, these measures fail to alter the underlying dynamics of demand. The state-run medical infrastructure is facing an acute shortage of specialized psychiatric beds and long-term rehabilitation staff capable of handling the extreme violence and profound cognitive deficits associated with chronic methamphetamine psychosis. The institutions are attempting to fight a highly adaptive, decentralized chemical wildfire using bureaucratic instruments designed for the static, state-controlled trafficking networks of the previous decade. Compounding this institutional paralysis is a new, insidious ideological threat that has emerged in the margins of the crisis. In several highly populated Muslim-majority countries outside the immediate Gulf zone, including parts of maritime Southeast Asia, low-level radical preachers and criminal syndicates have begun weaponizing fringe theological interpretations. They argue that because methamphetamine is a modern synthetic compound not explicitly named in classical Islamic jurisprudence, and because it temporarily provides an intense focus that can be channeled into long hours of prayer or study, its use is permissible under specific circumstances, although mainstream Islamic scholars and global religious authorities have forcefully condemned these assertions as a dangerous distortion of the fundamental principle of hifz al-aql, the sacred obligation to protect the human intellect from impairment. The mere existence of these arguments provides a powerful psychological shield for vulnerable, unemployed youth seeking purpose or escape in stagnant local economies. The drug does not merely exploit weak borders and broken economies, it systematically maps onto the exact cultural, structural, and psychological vulnerabilities of the societies it infects. The current reality of the Middle East in 2026 is a landscape where the old geopolitical calculus has been quietly rendered irrelevant by a white crystal. For over a decade, international analysts focused exclusively on wars, revolutions, and state collapses, believing that stability could be restored by drawing new borders or signing diplomatic accords. But while the states were watching the horizon for conventional threats, a borderless ghost economy was hollowing out the interior of the social structure from within. The collapse of the Syrian Captagon Empire did not end the region's drug crisis. It merely removed the brakes from a far more lethal engine. The problem has now progressed past the point of structural reversibility, leaving behind a generation of rewired brains, silent families, and institutions that are learning to police a ruin.